A couple of years ago, as some of you know, I was invited, or maybe you don't know, I don't know actually. As some of you may know, I was invited to sit on the board of my rabbinical association, the RRA, the Reconstructionist Rabbinical Association. And last spring, the RRA CEO of 9 years had announced that she was stepping down, and my friend Rabbi James Green asked me to join him on the search committee to help us find the new CEO of the RRA, and I instinctively agreed to do this. While the search won't actually kick off in earnest until after the High Holy Days, I have been reflecting since its invitation on the different leaders that the RRA has had over the years. In particular, I have found myself thinking about one, Rabbi Richard Hirsch, who was the CEO of the RRA for many, many years. He was one of the original Reconstructionist rabbis. He was a wise, compassionate, dedicated teacher of Torah with many loyal admirers and students. What I remember most about him at this moment, however, is his car. Because the car was a Miata, which is really interesting all by itself. Because if you are not a car person, as I am not a car person, and you don't know what a Miata is, you Google it, as I did. And a quick Google search revealed that a Miata is the perfect sports car, designed to be tolerable as a daily driven vehicle. And one of the reasons that I remember this car is because it seemed so incongruent to me at the time that this wise, elder, esteemed rabbi drove a sports car. It wasn't just the car, though. It was the license plate on his car, because he had a vanity plate. You know what a vanity plate is? You can give the RMV even more of your money, and you tell them what you want to put on the license plate, and they'll stamp it for you, and you put that on your car. So, Rabbi Hirsch's car was memorable, but his license plate was even more so. The license plate on his Miata said Miata. But actually, there was a space in the middle. So although it said Miata, what it really said was me, ata. So now this is really funny. This is a very funny and very clever play on words. Miata, mi ata. Again, according to Rav Google, Miata is an old German word that means reward. Who knew that? Does anybody know that? I didn't know that. No. But miata, I didn't have to look up. I know what that means. That's Hebrew. And it's pretty basic Hebrew at that. Does anybody know what that means? Miata. Who are you? And ever since I saw Rabbi Hirsch's car and his license plate, I've always been slightly puzzled by them. As nebbish, bookish, wise, esteemed elder rabbi driving a sports car every day with a license plate that seems to be, I don't know, fairly aggressive and antagonistic. Maybe that's not totally fair, okay. But I am from New York City. And so where I come from, the question, who are you, is usually pronounced, who the heck are you? And through this lens, the implied answer to the question, who the heck are you, is, you're nobody. And with road rage being the horrible phenomenon that it is, I always thought it was kind of sneaky and a little chutzpahdik that this elder esteemed rabbi would drive around and get his road rage aggression out on people in a way that probably almost nobody would understand, and so it wouldn't get him in trouble. And honestly, I thought about it once every long while over the past 15 years or so, and every time I think about it, I have a little smile on my face and a little chuckle to myself. I go something like this, oh right, Rabbi Hirsch, Miata, Miata, ha ha ha. Until this past summer. This past summer, I found myself thinking about Rabbi Hirsch's license plate completely differently. I now actually no longer think he was being chutzpahdik and aggressive. I now believe that he was doing what we hope all rabbis do. I believe he was teaching Torah. He was perhaps reminding us that the essential question of our lives is, who are you? In fact, I believe, and numerous commentators agree, that when Adonai famously asked the first human being in Bereshit 3:9, the very first question that God ever asked in the entire Torah, Ayeka, where are you? It's just another way of asking, who are you? Torah understands, of course, that we are not static, fixed, frozen entities, but rather each and every one of us is a shape-shifting, constantly evolving being. And therefore, for each of us, the answer to the question, where are you, or who are you, is going to change over the course of our lives. And in order to live a deeply engaged Jewish spiritual life, among other things, we need to be constantly engaged with this question and struggling to answer it for ourselves. Rabbi Hirsch was teaching Torah with a sports car. Ayeka, where are you? Miata, who are you? As many of you know, I have been studying for the past 2 years with the IJS, the Institute for Jewish Spirituality. They run a clergy leadership program called, wait for it, the Clergy Leadership Program. And as part of the Clergy Leadership Program, we had to read a book this past summer. The book was called, I love this title, the book was called How to Lead When You Don't Know Where You're Going, written by Susan Beaumont. And in her book, Beaumont posited that we can't fully know where we are or who we are if we don't have a clear narrative of where we have come from. In other words, Beaumont argued that our ability to locate ourselves in the present moment of our lives depends on the context of where we have come from and where we hope to go. In fact, Beaumont goes a step further and argued that we need to identify our, she calls them, origin stories, the narrative that give rise to who we are as individual beings. And within the origin story, she said that we are to identify core values that we can use in our lives today to guide us in making meaningful action choices. She goes on to explain that in her view, we can identify and clarify our core values by remembering and analyzing our past, our history, and by asking ourselves the following questions. What is important about my past? What is the best from my past that I have inherited and will carry into the future? Susan Beaumont writes largely in this book about community, congregation, but I would argue that her principles and her teaching apply not only at the communal level, but also at the individual level, the familial level, and at all levels of community. Allow me to give you an example of one of my core origin stories that I often tell. My grandparents, Zichronam Livracha, Hilda and Paul Wolf, who my sister and I affectionately called Omi and Opa, were German Jews at the turn of the 20th century. They grew up and lived in Cologne, Germany, where they came of age and met and married in 1936 during Hitler and the Nazi Party's rise to power. I've always identified my Omi and Opa as Holocaust survivors, even though they were never imprisoned in a concentration camp. My Omi and Opa fled Germany as refugees in 1939 on one of the last trains out, mere months before Hitler closed the borders to Jews trying to escape. Not much detail is known in our family about their experiences in Germany during the Nazi rise to power, except that it was horrific. Their entire families were eventually murdered, with the exception of my Omi's sister Marga, who also survived the war by escaping to the land that would become the modern-day state of Israel. My Omi and Opa fled to London and settled there, illegally, of course. They didn't have working papers, they didn't have visas, they didn't have permission to live there. They found a small community of refugees and they made a life for themselves in wartime London amid raids and bombing campaigns. My mother was born there in 1944, and 4 years later, Hilda and Paul decided to leave their refugee community behind to try to make their way to the United States of America. And in a familiar story shared by so many Jewish families who immigrated to the United States during that era, they came over on a boat and made their way through Ellis Island. How many of us, out of curiosity, have family that came through Ellis Island? Look at that. A very familiar story indeed. What makes my story a little bit different, however, is that my mother was born deaf. And because of her deafness, the three of them, Hilda, Paul, and Irene, were initially denied admission to the United States. They were denied admission specifically because my mother, Irene, is deaf. And deaf people in 1948 were considered handicapped. And handicapped people apparently posed a potential burden to the United States government. And in order to prove that my mother would not become a burden to society, they were required to appear before a judge in an immigration court on Ellis Island. My mother was just 4 years old. In front of a judge, Hilda, my grandmother, asked for some paper and something to draw with or color with. And my grandmother then instructed my mother to draw several pictures for the judge, which she did without difficulty. And according to my Omi, who used to tell me this story, the bailiff then took the pictures to the judge, who looked at them carefully and slowly, and then declared, "My 4-year-old grandson can't do this. She's fine." And he signed the paperwork to allow them admission to the United States instead of sending them back to Europe to what would have been almost certain death. In light of Beaumont's work, I understand that I have several core values that were formed as a direct result of this origin story. These values include, for me, a strong Jewish identity. It was because they were Jewish, after all, that my grandparents were forced to leave their comfortable homes and that their entire family were murdered. I also believe that my strong deaf identity is derived in part from this story, which connects me both to the historical belief that deaf people were once considered defective and burden to society, but also to a legacy of strength and purpose, as deaf people like my mother have proven time and time again that notwithstanding our disability, we are intelligent, capable, and able to be fully functioning, contributing members of society. And in many ways, you could argue, my whole life has been dedicated to living out the value of a strong and meaningful Jewish and deaf identity. Me, ata. Who are you? I think Beaumont's idea regarding origin stories and how they relate to who we are today, what our values are, and who we want to be in the world are sound. You should be thinking at this moment about your own story. What are your origin stories? And what are the core values you draw from your origin story, and how are you living out those values in your life and in the world today. Mi ata. Who are you? I have a story, a lot of story. You have a story, lots of story. And we all share a story. We share a few stories, actually. One of the stories that we all share is a meaningful and deep connection that binds us all into a unique and sacred relationship with each other as members of a shared faith-based community. I don't care at this moment if you joined Kerem Shalom last week, if you joined Kerem Shalom last summer, if you joined Kerem Shalom 36 years ago, or if you've never joined Kerem Shalom and you're just visiting with us this evening. Right here and right now, we are all members of this sacred community linked in a shared common story and arguably a shared destiny. Kerem Shalom began because a few random Jewish families in the historic town of Concord, Massachusetts, understood the importance of Jewish identity and of connecting with other Jews. When there are lots of Jews around you, as is the case in large cities like New York City and Boston, Chicago, Los Angeles, and so on, the importance of the Jewish community is significant, but in some ways, arguably, maybe taken for granted. But if you find yourself in the birthplace of the American Revolution in the mid-1950s and 1960s, where there aren't all that many other Jews at all, and you're not entirely sure how welcome you are there, what do? You seek each other out. And that is what the founders of Kerem Shalom did. I sat down with David Orloff this past summer. David, are you here this evening? David. I sat down with David this past summer, Kerem Shalom's own resident historian. And David reminded me of the existence of this great booklet. This is a little booklet, a history of the Concord area Jewish group that was written by Lucy Rappaport and published in 1985. I spent some time with this booklet and interviewing some of the folks who contributed to Kerem Shalom's early days. And he also reminded me, by the way, David also reminded me that this year, 5785, the year that begins tonight, is Kerem Shalom's 36th anniversary of being in this building. 36, as you know, is double chad, life to life. How could the founders of Kerem Shalom have ever known in the mid-1960s, before some of us, not saying who, were even born, what fruits their efforts would bear? This group of Jews, some friends, some strangers, originally started as the Concord Lincoln Jewish Study Group, and they officially formed in 1968 when Bob and Joe Asher, along with Nesson, Hochman, and Bennett, decided that they wanted to give their children a Jewish education. To support the children's education, the parents began learning themselves, and they began celebrating Jewish holidays as a group of family. In these early years, the students met one day a week at the West Concord Union Church, where some of us are taking a class right now, and one day a week at St. Anne's Church in Lincoln, hence the Concord Lincoln Jewish Study Group. In 1971, Mel and Phyllis Kamak moved into Concord and eventually joined the group and became active members. Under their leadership, the group decided to try to increase their membership. They planned a social event for all of the Jews in Concord, and they advertised it in the local paper. What I wouldn't give to see that advertisement. Are you Jewish? Come join us. Nobody had that advertisement anymore. Susan Markston planned the party with a wine tasting, and to everyone's surprise, about 75 people showed up. And as the story goes, the most often heard question of the evening, the most often heard quotation of the evening was, I didn't know you were Jewish. In 1978, the Concord Area Jewish Group, they had changed their name at this point, hired Rabbi Michael Luckin and held their very first High Holy Day services in Concord at 51 Walden Street. About 200 of them attended services for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur 46 years ago tonight. The first baby naming, B'nai Mitzvah, community Seder took place in 1979 to 1980, and numerous Jewish Concord firsts followed. And then, in 1983, Schneider, Celia Schneider, is Celia here? Celia, maybe on Zoom. Celia's parents introduced Rosalie Gerut to Philip Kamak, who invited Rosalie Gerut to sing at a service. In fact, Rosalie showed me last week her machzor had a nameplate, a sticker in it that dated 1983. And I know it wasn't full-time since then, Rosalie. You often mentioned to me it was full-time, it was part-time, a little bit here and a little bit there. But Rosalie had been a profound and integral part of Kerem Shalom's history for the past 41 years. It's all right. We're about the same age. In 1985, the families held a discussion in January about the pros and cons of trying to raise money to buy land and to build a home of our own. The discussion initially, no consensus, no agreement. But at the board meeting in March, 3 months later, a unanimous vote was taken in favor of the Concord Area Jewish Group acquiring its own home. And at the annual meeting in 1988, Mr. Alan Spiller, sitting over here to my right, made a motion that the Concord Area Jewish Group should adopt a Hebrew name. And the motion carried unanimously. So in 1989, David Orlenoff convened a committee of 5 people to explore various options for what we were going to call ourselves. And he set out the following criteria. Number 1, the name had to be easily pronounceable by radio announcers who were announcing school snow closing. I know that's not how we learn about snow closing anymore, but there was a very important reason for this. The reason for this was that Cherry, David's wife, had once heard Temple Emunah in Lexington referred to by a radio announcer as Temple Enema. Can't do that. No. Can't say that from the Bima on Rosh Hashanah, Rabbi. Although, whether or not you consider Kerem Shalom to be an easily pronounceable name is still up for debate. I have run into my fair share of people who call it Kareem Shalom. Anyway. Number 2, criteria. The name should not be a cliche. It should be a completely unique synagogue name. And number 3, even though the word shalom is a sort of a cliche in a synagogue name, since one of the translations of Concord, the town in which we are, Little C Concord, is agreement, getting along, partnership, harmony, shalom. Maybe shalom could be part of the Hebrew name. So the committee met, but they could not come up with any good name candidates for the synagogue. So the day after the meeting, David Orlenoff went to work and told a co-worker about this dilemma. The next day, the co-worker went back to David and came up with Vineyard, as in Vineyard of Peace. David was very enthusiastic with this idea and reconvened the committee. So at the next committee meeting, 2 potential synagogue names came forward. Kerem Shalom, Vineyard of Peace, and Shir Shalom, song of peace. The vote was, you ready for this? 3-2 for Kerem Shalom. And at the annual meeting in 1989, the name was officially adopted just in time to invite people to the building dedication of Kerem Shalom that September 35 plus years ago, when Rosalie wrote and sang an original song for the building dedication. And David, when he tells this story, likes to add that shortly after the name was adopted, some of the workers on this building construction project found some wild grapevine growing on this property. So perhaps this had been a kerem, a vineyard, all along. Anyway, these are some of Kerem Shalom's origin stories, and they belong to all of us. They're your story, my story. So what are some of the values that we might take from these stories today? Several values stand out in my mind, but first and foremost, going back to the Concord area Jewish group and to the Concord Lincoln study group before that, there is the value of being a group, a congregation, a community, a kehillah. We recognize that even today, by the way, in 2024, 5785, being Jewish means something. Being Jewish by yourself means something. Being Jewish together in community with other members of the tribe and fellow travelers means something profound. Many of us can probably point to a specific moment or an incident in our lives when we realized that our Judaism meant something. Many college students who maybe hadn't given being Jewish that much of a thought while growing up got a crash course in being Jewish on college campuses last year. You see, even if you don't think that being Jewish is a big deal, I've got news for you. Most of the world thinks that you being Jewish is a really big deal. And there is safety, and there is comfort, and there is familiarity in a mishpacha, in community, in Kerem Shalom. Mi ata? Who are you? And by the way, we will tell another origin story tomorrow morning. It's the same one we tell every year on Rosh Hashanah. When we chant Torah on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, we are retelling the core origin story of the Jewish people. We are recounting the legacy of Abraham, Sarah, Abraham, and Sarah, and their admittedly dysfunctional families. And tomorrow morning, we will explore some of the core values that are embedded in those stories that we are still living out in our lives today as we share them. Mi ata? Who are you? Thank you, Rabbi Hirsch. These are some of my origin stories, and these are some of your origin stories. But what are your personal origin stories? Who are your ancestors? And why are these important questions to explore tonight? It is not because of the seductive allure of nostalgia. We don't look back to get stuck or trapped in yearning for what once was, but for the purpose of locating ourselves in the present moment of our lives and figuring out how the lessons we have learned and the core values instilled in us can help us figure out a way to keep moving forward. It is so important that we keep telling these stories. It is so important that we keep our values present, meaningful, and real for ourselves as we make our way forward in life. And just in case it wasn't totally obvious to you yet, telling these stories means that you need someone to listen to your story. You need someone to bear witness to your story. You need someone or someones to bear witness to you. We need each other. We need Kerem Shalom. I leave you with a mission. Your mission, should you choose to accept it, between now and Yom Kippur, 10 days, is to think through one or two or more of your origin stories and to explore the question of what are the core values that you can extract from those stories, and then find someone who hasn't heard it 1,000 times already. Find someone and tell them your story. Mi ata. Who are you? Shana Tova u'metuka. May it be a good and sweet year for all of us.